Inside Events, a new international contemporary podcast focused on the key issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Luke Potwarka, and we're going to be talking about the trickle-down effects of events. Welcome, Luke. If you could give us a little bit about your role, organization, and why you interested in the trickle-down effects of events in particular.
Great. Thanks for having me, Mike. I'm an associate professor and director of the Spectator Experience and Technology Lab at the University of Waterloo. I'm in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies there, and our university is situated in Waterloo, Ontario. So I'm currently also leading the work of an international collaborative on trickle-down effect research, which has a mission to advance theory and evidence as it relates to the trickle-down effect.
That's really interesting. When we think about the trickle-down effect, Luke, for those that are unaware, maybe first-year students, how would you describe it and define it?
Absolutely. So the trickle-down effect really refers to this process by which people are inspired by elite sport, sports people, or sports events to participate themselves. And the trickle-down effect really gets at the question, can watching elite sport events or athletes inspire sport participation? So some of the outcomes of a trickle-down effect are thought to include, increase in participation frequency, so being active more often, participating in sport after a long hiatus. So maybe, you watched, you were a skier at one point in your life, you became inspired after watching skiing at the Olympics, and you picked it back up kind of later in life. Then there's also the switching of participation between activities. So maybe, one sport might pull you into another, so you might be a bobsledder and you might be pulled into being a track athlete or a sprinter, for example, or vice versa. And then there can also be an increase in the number of new participants into a sport altogether. So just completely never exposed to this sport, and now I want to try it and do it. And the trickle-down effect is really thought to result from three main mechanisms. So the first is the effect of elite hosting or hosting elite sport events. The effect of sporting success, okay, so winning or winning championships or medals, and the effect of role modeling, right? So the extent to which athletes can really inspire role modeling. I'll also say that the trickle-down effect is also known by many names. So there's the demonstration effect. It's been called the inspirational effect. It's been called, participation impacts. It's been called the virtual cycle of sport participation. But by and large, they're all referring to that idea of, can watching or consuming or hosting events really inspire new sport participation?
And Luke, you take a kind of, as I would, an optimistic view of trickle down, like most of the examples that you gave, positive. We both believe in the power of sport and events for social good and for inspiring and trickling down positive rays of sunlight. But are they always good? Is there kind of a lot of time whereby, like, actually the trickle down is not so pleasant?
Right, exactly, Mike. And I will say that the trickle-down effect is a very contentious and heavily debated concept in the academic literature and in the political discourse as it relates to events. So no, I mean, we tend sometimes to view these things through rose-colored glasses, but to date, evidence of trickle-down effects has really been mixed, and especially at the population level, with many studies just not being able to produce evidence for the effect itself. But thanks to the work of Tax and Chalop and Meisner, the general consensus in the literature has been that simply staging the events or event hosting, may not be enough to inspire population level changes in sport or physical activity participation. But instead, elite and major sport events need to be leveraged, right? And we hear a lot about this concept of event leverage if they're really to have any meaningful impact on the general population. And really leveraging is based on this premise that increased participation levels or the trickle-down effect is much more likely to result from the combined influence of hosting or staging an event, elite athlete role modeling, and the implementation of interventions designed to promote sport and physical activity opportunities in conjunction with the event itself. And I'll also say that in addition to these leveraging initiatives, my colleagues and I also advocate that we need much more stronger and more robust evidence and data. We need more coordinated evidence of trickle-down effects among researchers and among industry professionals and government and policymakers to draw better conclusions. So much of the knowledge that we have of the trickle-down effect, are generated from secondary and theoretical mass participation data, right? So we've got a lot of work to do in the space. So we're not seeing a lot of evidence, but I think there's more we can do to at least interrogate it as a phenomenon.
And we could apply that critique to absolutely every sort of measure of impact with events and festivals, right? Major events, speculative projects that kind of say that they're going to do one thing and then present kind of fairly underwhelming evidence of actually achieving the sort of so-called legacies that they espouse in the bid documents and all that sort of thing. And it is that absence of data. We have literally come to that. It doesn't matter whether it was the chat with John Welty Peachy, which people should go back to, and because that was a really good chat about this, or Laura. We had a good chat about kind of disability when it comes to kind of participation and that sort of thing. It doesn't matter what you look like. There's a lot of shortcutting when it comes to data and evidence and peacocking that these things are brilliant. But not enough kind of substance. I so agree, and that is just the lesson that everyone should take, just generally from these podcasts.
That's right.
When it comes to why we should care, it's obvious, right? It really, really obvious based on what you said. But is there any kind of key points that you want to drill home, Luke?
Excellent question. Why should we care about this in the first place? And, why has there been, so much invested into this? And for me, it comes down to that, claims of trickle-down effects are often used to justify public expenditure into hosting events, into staging these events. It's one of the rationale, provided to citizens and taxpayers and people that actually invest in these games, that, it will have this trickle-down effect. So for me, the concept needs to be interrogated with evidence and with good sound research in order so that we can deliver and find ways to strategize, at least in terms of how we can deliver these intended participatory outcomes and impacts. We also need evidence and research in this area to develop and implement effective event leveraging programs and initiatives, that can be used to promote sport and leverage the events. So we need research in this space to do that. We also need better theoretical understandings of trickle-down effect. We should care about the theory. We need to move beyond the anecdotal and examine how, why, and under what conditions might people be inspired to participate themselves, in response to the event. And, while there may be limited evidence of the trickle-down effect in the general population, I can assure you, just in my own work, that people and youth can be inspired by events and athletes, and it happens every day. And as it relates to the trickle-down effect, there's a desperate need to remove, systemic barriers to participation for equity-deserving groups and racialized people. And so, why people should care about this is that the trickle-down effect is really an inspiration, is really gets at what we're at the heart of the power of representation in sport, right? So I think of a few examples. I think about after winning the gold medal in figure skating in Beijing 2022, Nathan Chan, who stood there and said, having an athlete that looks like you gives you hope that you can do the same. Right. And, for Nathan Chan, that was Michelle Kwan. That was that person for him that really inspired him to take it up. Right. And that's why we should care about this, because representation is important and it matters in sport. And we can also look at the inspiring performances of Canadian athlete and bobsledder Cynthia Paya. In a CBC interview she just gave, she's from Toronto. She recalled seeing Canada's Shelley Ann Brown, who's Black, flying down the Whistler track with her partner en route to deliver a silver medal for Canada in the 2-win event. And Apaya told a reporter that she thought, "Oh wait, I can see myself in her, and there is something this is something that I can definitely do." Or at least it piqued her interest to try it out, right? And she said that to a reporter. And for me, that was just like, yes, this is why this is important, right? So inspiration requires people to envision a future self participating in an activity. So people must see possibilities in order to enact change, right? And this is why I think the concept of this trickle-down effect and inspiration is just so important.
That's really good. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah.
There's some really good examples there, and personally, I can empathize with that position as well. There was in academia, not a lot of people kind of looked or sounded like me at the very beginning, and there was a couple that I thought, oh well, if you can kind of do it, I can do it, and it affects everywhere. Um, if you think about the role of the universities. Luke, you're kind of really engaged, and there's so many people actually in the Canadian universities that are really engaged with people on the ground trying to kind of tackle this sort of issue. What's the role of universities for pushing forward this agenda?
Yeah, I think there's a big role for the universities, and I think it has to provide space for researchers to undertake this. I think there needs to be collaborative spaces. There needs to be international coordination because I think for universities, they're uniquely positioned to actually we have built-in collaborations. We can cut across universities across the globe to help develop evidence, right? I also think in terms of leveraging, right, and in terms of you know um, you know, trying to capitalize on the power of these events to inspire people, researchers and universities can play a role in funding and developing and helping assist community sport programs, right? To come about, and they can be sites where we can evaluate the effectiveness of what types of sport programs work, right, under what conditions. So I think the university can play a huge role in both mobilizing and collaborating research in the area.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, I
Yeah.
completely agree. I kind of say that kind of some universities in some countries are so much better than doing it than others. I just
Yeah.
think about where I am, the University of Central Florida. The university has grown up with the city, grown up with the communities. The people that went to the uni have stayed close by. They're now our leaders in the community, and so there is this really strong symbiotic link between the two. It's really great. But actually, I look at the UK education and university sector and think actually there was a little impetus to really engage for lots of different kind of cultural, social reasons why universities just don't have that much purchase in the communities that they're in. But definitely kind of reaching out to your local university is so important, and just the sports management people, the event management people, the tourism management people. There's so many people that would just be welcome open arms, right?
That's right.
For those that are listening to this. Um, if we think about, we've got probably about 5 minutes left, but Luke, if we think about the future of this kind of area, are there any kind of key trends that you think that people should be looking out for, Luke?
Absolutely, Mike. I think more and more major events and major sport events are being hosted in multiple host cities. And so, to this point about collaboration, we need to work collaboratively to synthesize and collect data on trickle-down effects across national and regional jurisdictions. Um, so that's a future trend I think we need to look at. Rising ticketing costs and
Mm.
accessibility of events. Not everyone can watch in-person and live sport events and don't have access to it. And people may be inspired by sports stimuli that transcends the pitch and the field of play. I'm thinking about documentaries, social media, popular culture. They may be also critical sources of trickle down effects or inspiration, and be more accessible modalities of inspiration than events themselves, than attending, live events. The need to design vicarious and immersive spectator experiences. There's a growing need to consider the role of technology, virtual reality, augmented reality. What role do they play in inspiration? Right, and producing trickle down effects. So new ways of experiencing and consuming events that may precede and help people become inspired and make decisions to participate. Um, Making sport events more accessible to diverse audiences. So we need to put effort into making sport events more accessible to spectators by educating them about the nuances and the rules of the sport before, during, and after competitions. And doing so may create more engaged and inspired spectators when we know what's happening in these sports that come to our communities that we may have never witnessed before in our entire life, right? So I think as well. Further research is needed to examine trickle-down effects relating to non-mega sport events, non-major events, community events, indigenous games, parasport events, and athletes. That's a whole area that we need to look at and to uncover these experiences. And um, we always focus in this area on people that are already active, right? And that's what a lot of the trends say. It's already active people become more active sport participants, but we need to put emphasis on non-participants and people from equity deserving groups, those who are systematically excluded from participation, because of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, ability, disability. We need to make efforts to remove barriers, post-event participation for racialized people and marginalized communities that need it the most, right? And that's part of this work as well, that we haven't really engaged with in this sub area as much as we should, right? And then, the future is about international research collaborations. We have right now an international team of researchers who are working to establish a repository of national and more localized sport participation surveillance data, across the world. Because what we're finding is, look at, these trickle-down effects are not limited to host community. They can extend far beyond host nation, right? Millions of people watch people from their community win medals all over the globe, right? And that can be a site for inspiration. It's not like it's just limited to the host community. So I think we need to think about trickle-down effects as a global impact, right? And what is the global footprint of sport participation after some of these major Olympic and Paralympic games? So just looking at the host is limiting what could be happening. So we need to come together to capture some of those data, right, to see what's happening. And then I'll leave it with capacity and retention. So evidence is showing that, okay, we can be inspired by events. Maybe there's some programs that we get started, but people don't stay. So we need to look at capacity and retention. So, once we're inspired, like, now what? like we have to make sure we nurture, and sport organizations nurture these newly formed relationships, right? Like, we can't just let them happen because people won't stay committed. So it's not just enough to get people in the door. It's about how do we keep new sport participants into a sport. And then again, if we want to make sure that we really capitalize on trickle-down effects, researchers, policymakers, community sport organizations, we have to ensure spectator and participation opportunities, before, during, and after events are welcoming and they're accessible for everyone. And I think that's really our challenge is to make these events vis-a-vis the trickle-down effect accessible and welcoming. And because going into a new sporting culture or trying something new for the first time, it can be really daunting, and it can be difficult and challenging. So we have to make sure that we accept and are welcoming into some of these new sport cultures that people have no exposure to before.
Thanks, Luke. That was really
Yeah.
interesting, and it chimes to kind of every event that goes on. Every single one should, in some sense, ideally create a net positive benefit that shifts the dial towards increased, for example, positive outcome. It makes me think, if anyone's interested in kind of understanding that a bit more, Vasilios Sayakis and I had a podcast, and he was just talking about there needs to be so much more planning from at the destination level or the convention bureau level or the sports commission level, whichever level is responsible for strategically planning events in that county or state or whatever. They need to know what exactly every single event is doing to shift the dial positively for the next one. In this sense, it's about representation. It's about inclusion in sport, etc. But it applies to all the other principles that we talk on the podcast as well. So that
It does,
chimes
Mike.
well.
And it starts at the bid stage. It starts early. These planning efforts need to be, and event leveraging, it needs to start, and it needs to be coordinated, right from the beginning. It can't be an afterthought. And I think that's where you're really going to see some meaningful impact over the long term.
And do we plan? I know that I said the last one was the last question, but do we plan well enough for this at the bidding stage, or is there just still a gaping hole?
I think in words. I think in rhetoric. I think there's lots of, in bid documents that this will happen, but after the 16 days, what happens? Sometimes those initiatives fizzle, or they lack funding, or there isn't a leadership, that takes it on. So I think there's a big room for improvement in the planning function as it relates to event leveraging and really fully realizing the potential of trickle-down effects.
Thanks, Luke. I have to say, the whole kind of question over rhetoric reality has been something that has absolutely not marred, but shadowed everything that we do in academia. It's always exposing that difference. And yet, event upon event, it's the same thing. And it just doesn't seem to be changing that much. I think that actually, I'm sure that there are some positive changes, but I think people are just better at covering up or saying the right things even better than creating substantive change. Just thinking about London 2012, the whole volunteering aspects, it wasn't leveraged at all. It just went into the abyss. We had a volunteering program, and that could have been leveraged to put people in better work, or more people in work, or integrated socioeconomically deprived communities into the workplace through a volunteering program as the one rung on the ladder. Nothing happened. Disabled people in the UK, people with visible and invisible disabilities, the same thing. Disabled people's lives were seen as worsening after these things instead of getting better. Okay, so a lot of people put that down to the political, economic climate, the cost of living crisis, etc. But still, there still needed to be a lot more done in that sense. So anyone listening to this who's in industry would now be thinking, oh, they're academics. Yeah, they didn't have access to this data set or that data. I hear it all the time. And it's an absence of data, and it's an absence of telling a good enough story as to why your event exists in society. And of course, anyone that's listening to this at the moment who might have that opposite opinion to us in this sense should come on this Inside Events and talk through the data and the evidence.
Absolutely. And I think just picking up on that point about evidence and data, and I think what, in terms of a trends in the last few years, I think what myself and other kind of researchers are calling for is, okay, let's look at this from a realist evaluation perspective. Let's, instead of saying, drawing conclusions at the population level, here's millions of people in a data set, and we didn't see a spike, or there was, so there was no such thing as it. I think we need to get more granular, more nuanced with data, and look at conditions and circumstances. For example, looking at youth populations, looking at just the neighborhood levels in communities that house venues, right? Looking where event leveraging did take place, and where there was best practices of really good strategies and good planning. Looking at the hometowns of medalists, right, that win medals, and looking at what happens to youth participation in certain sports. That's where you may see increases,
Shifting
right?
of the dial. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Rather than just saying, looking and saying, oh my gosh, there's nothing here, and then just leaving it. I think we have to do better. I think we need to get more granular, more nuanced, and look at some of those conditions and circumstances that might, support evidence a little more effectively.
Completely. No one's expecting that an event, or certainly a large-scale event that sucks a lot of public money, to do everything. Just be very, very clear as to what it was planning to do and how that stitches into the regional or national level domestic, social, economic policy. Just be clear. Just be clear. Just be clear in terms of what you hope the cause and effect was of having this, and buttress that with data. It doesn't seem to be a massive ask. It's about understanding what each event's doing, and I think that's why the Vasilios's work on event portfolios is so important, but yet underdone, which is that no one's really got a handle on what each one is doing and which KPIs are really applied to each one and what data they need. Instead, they just take a general approach to everything without strategically planning anything.
That's right.
And so that's it. Right. Luke, I could talk with you forever and a day. I have to say.
Me too.
But thank you so much for coming on Inside Events and talking through that. And hopefully we can have another discussion sometime later down the line about something more specific in terms of what you mentioned. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for having me.